Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture videos for Module 10. Module 10 covers Chapter 6 in the textbook, which is How Cells Harvest Chemical Energy, aka Cellular Respiration. Like I mentioned in the previous lecture videos, this topic is inherently challenging, probably one of the most challenging ones that we will cover this semester. So definitely take your time doing the textbook reading, search out any outside videos if you're confused about a topic, and feel free to email me with any questions that you have after going through this lecture. So a general introduction. Oxygen is a reactant in cellular respiration, which is the process that breaks down sugar and other food molecules and generates ATP, which is the energy currency in cells. It also generates heat as a byproduct of the reaction. Brown fat cells, which are really common in infants, have a short circuit in their cellular respiration, which generates only heat, not ATP. So the energy isn't harnessed into ATP, it's just generating heat. This is really good for infants because they do not have the ability to shiver. Their muscle fibers can't involuntarily contract like that to shiver and generate heat. So these brown fat cells that produce heat because of their short circuit are really important for keeping infants warm. They have found some brown fat in adults as well, and they're not quite sure its role, but they're looking into it as a possible weight loss method to try and see if you could turn more cells into just doing cellular respiration to generate heat. In this chapter, we're going to explore the stages of cellular respiration and how cells produce ATP in the presence of oxygen. The main topics that we'll cover in this chapter, in this video, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration, the aerobic harvesting of energy, which will give you a general overview. In the next video, we'll look specifically at the stages of cellular respiration. And then in the final video, we'll talk about fermentation, which is the anaerobic harvesting of energy, and then connections between different metabolic pathways in the body. So cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the aerobic harvesting of energy. Before we talk about cellular respiration specifically, I want to point out that photosynthesis and cellular respiration provide energy for life. We all know that life requires energy, and in almost all ecosystems, that energy ultimately comes from the sun and the energy in sunlight. There's a few random examples, such as deep sea thermal vents, where the energy is coming from the thermal vents, but in most ecosystems, it is the sun. So the sun is powering the energy transfers within the ecosystem, and then the reactions between photosynthesis and cellular respiration provide the energy for life. So we know that photosynthesis occurs in plants and some protists, any type of organism that has chloroplasts. Photosynthesis captures the energy from sunlight and creates organic molecules and oxygen, which are then the fuel for cellular respiration, which occurs in the mitochondria. Cellular respiration produces ATP, which powers most of the cellular work. Heat energy is a byproduct of this. The products from cellular respiration are the energy poor CO2 and H2O, which are the reactants in photosynthesis and become higher energy organic molecules after the addition of sunlight. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are tightly linked, and you need both to provide the energy for life. Almost all organisms have mitochondria, and again, only plants and photosynthetic protists have chloroplasts. We're going to take a little bit of a more in-depth look at photosynthesis here. In photosynthesis, the energy of sunlight right here is used to rearrange the atoms of carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, and it produces organic molecules, specifically the energy-rich glucose right here, and it releases oxygen as another product of this reaction. So this is the photosynthesis equation. CO2 plus H2O with the energy from sunlight reacts to form C6H12O6, glucose, and oxygen. In cellular respiration, that oxygen is consumed as organic molecules are broken down to CO2 and H2O, carbon dioxide and water. And the cell captures the energy released from this reaction as ATP. So we can take a look at a representation of that here. The two reactants are glucose and oxygen. Glucose is our energy-rich molecule. As glucose is broken down, energy is released, and we end up with carbon dioxide and water as the products of that reaction. Both of those are energy poor. The energy released is used to form ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. If you want to look at this in the equation written out form, it's C6H12O6, which is the chemical formula for glucose, plus 6O2. Oxygen turns into 6 CO2, carbon dioxide, and then 6 H2O, water. We looked at both of these equations in the last video for the membranes and energy lecture, but I did want to go over them in a little bit more depth here. Going back to this figure, you may have noticed that the products of carbon dioxide, 6 CO2, 6 H2O, are the reactants in photosynthesis, and vice versa. The products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, are the reactants in cellular respiration. So these two processes are, in essence, the reverse of each other. Photosynthesis generates high energy glucose and oxygen using the energy from sunlight. Cellular respiration breaks down glucose and creates carbon dioxide and water as a byproduct, which are then the reactants in the photosynthesis reaction. So these two processes are tightly linked, and you need both for life. Again, I just want to go over this figure one more time so that you can see the relationship. Photosynthesis uses the energy from sunlight to rearrange carbon dioxide and water into the energy-rich molecule glucose and oxygen. Glucose is then used in the mitochondria along with oxygen for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration produces ATP, which powers most cellular work. The byproducts of cellular respiration are carbon dioxide and water, which are then used in photosynthesis. So that whole cycle is a circle. I do just want to note again, in the last module, we learned that energy transfers are never 100% efficient. In fact, cellular respiration is about 34%, give or take, efficient. So the rest of that energy that is not converted to ATP, so everything outside of that 34%, will be lost as heat energy, which is how we are able to stay warm and what generates our body heat. Checkpoint question on this section. What is misleading about the following statement? Plant cells perform photosynthesis and animal cells perform cellular respiration. Take a second and think about that. So what's misleading about this is that this statement implies that plant cells only perform photosynthesis, whereas animal cells only perform cellular respiration. And we know that's not true. Animal cells do not perform photosynthesis. However, plant cells perform both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. They do both. They have mitochondria and chloroplasts. So the statement implies that cellular respiration does not occur in plant cells. However, almost all eukaryotic cells, including plant cells, use cellular respiration to obtain energy for their cellular work. So plant cells do cellular respiration and photosynthesis, whereas animal cells are only able to do cellular respiration. When we breathe, that supplies the oxygen for use in cellular respiration and removes the carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct of cellular respiration. So breathing is tightly linked to cellular respiration. Respiration, which is often used as a synonym for breathing, refers to an exchange of gases. An organism, such as a human, obtains O2 or oxygen from its environment, and it releases CO2 or carbon dioxide as a waste product. Breathing and cellular respiration are closely related. As we can see over here, we know the cellular respiration equation down here. The reactants are glucose and oxygen, and then the products are carbon dioxide, water, and then that produces ATP. So we need oxygen in order for cellular respiration to occur, which is why we constantly need to be breathing in oxygen. We breathe in the oxygen, it goes to our lungs and then is transported in the bloodstream, where it goes to muscle cells, let's say specifically in the thigh, that are carrying out cellular respiration. That oxygen that was breathed in by this runner becomes the oxygen that is one of the reactants in cellular respiration. Once cellular respiration occurs, you have CO2 as a byproduct. That CO2 needs to be exhaled or gotten out of the body. So those muscle cells, CO2 will diffuse into the blood, which then carries the CO2 back to the lungs where we can then exhale it. So we are breathing in oxygen, which is one of the reactants of cellular respiration, and we are breathing out CO2, carbon dioxide, which is one of the products of cellular respiration. The process of cellular respiration banks energy in ATP molecules. It's kind of a weird term there. You can just think of it as storing energy in ATP molecules. Cellular respiration, like we learned in the last module, is an exergonic or an energy releasing process that transfers the chemical energy from glucose to the chemical energy of ATP. And it captures about 34% of the available energy originally stored in glucose, with the rest of the energy lost as heat. This is kind of a review from the previous module. We know that cellular respiration is not a 100% efficient energy transfer, and that energy is lost as heat in the process. And we know that it's about 34% efficient. So glucose and oxygen are two reactants. The multiple arrows here just represent the several steps of cellular respiration. It's not just one reaction, it's a bunch of little steps and reactions that ultimately get us to these products and ATP being produced. But this is a general summary equation of what occurs in cellular respiration. We've already gone over this a lot, so I'm not going to cover it in more depth, but if you have more questions, feel free to email me. I do just really want to specify the difference between reactants and products. I've used these terms a few times already in this lecture, and we're going to be using them a lot once we start focusing on the different stages of cellular respiration. I really want you guys to be able to identify what the reactants are and what the products are of each stage of cellular respiration. So remember, the reactants are anything on the left of the arrow, and the products are anything on the right of the arrow in a chemical reaction. Reactants are anything that goes into a chemical reaction, the molecules that are actually used up in the reaction. So in the overall cellular respiration equation, glucose and oxygen are your reactants, and then products will be anything that comes out of a chemical reaction, the molecules that are produced. In the overall cellular respiration equation, the products are carbon dioxide, water, and then the chemical formation of ATP. So just keep in mind the difference between reactants and products as we move forward. The human body uses energy from ATP for all its activities. I wanted to put this in here to conceptualize why energy from ATP is important. Your body requires a continuous supply of energy, specifically your brain. Your brain is about 20% of your energy usage per day because it takes a lot of ATP to power all the brain cells in their function of thinking and maintaining the body in homeostasis. Cellular respiration provides energy for body maintenance and voluntary activities. Body maintenance would be things that your brain is doing without you having to think about it, like breathing or digesting food, all of those things. Voluntary activities would be anything on this image down here, like driving a car, slow dancing, bicycling, etc. A balance of energy intake and expenditure is required to maintain a healthy weight. And this image down here just shows the typical energy expenditure per hour of each of these activities in kilocalories per hour. These are kilocalories, which is just calories with a capital C. Kilocalories are what, if you were to take up a snack from the grocery store and look at the label, everything is listed in kilocalories on that label. So sitting and writing, low energy expenditure. We get up to higher and higher energy expenditures the highest would be running for an hour at 8 to 9 miles per hour, would burn about 979 kilocalories. A quick checkpoint question to test your skills at interpreting an image or a graph. While walking at 3 miles per hour, how far would you have to travel to burn off the equivalent of an extra slice of pizza, which has about 475 kilocalories? How long would that take? The first thing we need to do is figure out how many kilocalories an hour walking at 3 miles per hour gives you. So we'll go find walking 3 miles per hour, and we'll see that it burns about 245 kilocalories per hour. Our pizza slice was 475 kilocalories. So if we divide that by 2, we'll get roughly 245. So we see that we would have to walk about 6 miles, which would take about 2 hours. And then it says, now you understand why the most effective exercise for losing weight is pushing away from the table, because those extra calories or kilocalories can be hard to burn off and take about 2 hours of walking at 3 miles per hour. Okay, back to the more nitty-gritty scientific part of this lecture. In cellular respiration, cells capture energy from electrons falling from organic fuels like glucose to oxygen. One thing I want to say, cellular respiration and the way we're going to learn it is focused on glucose as the organic fuel. It doesn't always have to be glucose. It can be other organic fuels that get fed into different parts of the cellular respiration process. But the way we're going to learn it is using glucose as the organic fuel. So electrons are going to fall from glucose to oxygen. How do your cells extract energy from fuel molecules? The answer involves the transfer of electrons in chemical reactions. I have a few little acronyms that would be helpful to write down that refer to oxidation and reduction. Oxidation and reduction are terms that you're going to hear a lot as we discuss cellular respiration, and it's important to know what these terms mean. A helpful acronym to remember this is OIL-RIG. OIL-RIG stands for oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. So remember oiled rig, it will help you a lot. Oxidation is the loss of either energy, electrons, or hydrogens. Those three can kind of be used interchangeably. Reduction is the gain of the same three: energy, electrons, or hydrogens. Electrons and hydrogens are used interchangeably because if you look at hydrogen on the periodic table, it has an atomic number of 1, which means it has 1 proton and 1 electron. So 1 hydrogen atom is equivalent to 1 electron because it has 1 electron. So electrons and hydrogens can kind of be used interchangeably when you think about oxidation and reduction. Oxidation is exergonic, so energy is given off when oxidation occurs and energy, electrons, or hydrogens are lost. Reduction is a gain of the energy, electrons, or hydrogens and is typically endergonic. Energy is required for a reduction to occur. So hopefully you've written down oil rig. Just remember, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. If we look at the overall cellular respiration equation, we can see oxidation and reduction occurring just in the base chemical formula. We can see that glucose over here, C6H12O6, is oxidized. It loses hydrogen atoms and it becomes 6CO2. So notice glucose has hydrogen, H12. CO2 over here does not have any hydrogen. So we can say that glucose has been oxidized. It has lost its hydrogen atoms. If we look at oxygen, those hydrogen atoms have to go somewhere. Oxygen on the left side of the equation actually gains those hydrogen atoms to become H2O. So oxygen is reduced. It gains hydrogen atoms throughout the process of the reaction. Typically, oxidations and reductions are always coupled. When you have an oxidation, you will have a reduction somewhere else in the chemical equation, and that's what we see here. Glucose is oxidized. It loses its hydrogen atoms and becomes CO2. oxygen is reduced, it gains hydrogen atoms and becomes H2O. Another thing I want you to be aware of before we start talking about the stages of cellular respiration is that electrons removed from the organic fuel molecules, which means an oxidation occurs, are then transferred to an electron carrier, such as NAD+, which would be a reduction. So our organic fuel, which is typically glucose, is going to lose 2 electrons. We know that oxidation is loss, so this means our organic fuel was oxidized. The electron carrier over here, NAD+, is going to take those 2 electrons, so it will be reduced. Reduction is gain. It gained 2 electrons. NAD+ will be reduced to NADH and carry those electrons. This is accomplished through a dehydrogenase, which removes the 2 H+, the hydrogen ions, so hydrogen and its proton, and the 2 electrons. NAD+ becomes NADH, so it takes those 2 electrons and only 1 of the hydrogen ions. There are 2. The other hydrogen ion is just released into the cell, which becomes important later. NADH, which is our electron carrier, then passes its electrons down an electron transport chain. So NADH here is carrying 2 electrons. It passes them to the electron transport chain. So it loses its electrons. Remember, oxidation is loss. NADH is then oxidized back to NAD+, and when this happens, that other hydrogen ion is also released into the cell. NAD+ can then go back to become reduced again by electrons from more organic fuel. The 2 electrons have been dropped off at this electron transport chain, and these electrons are going to fall from carrier to carrier. The carriers are these purple carrier proteins here. The final electron acceptor is oxygen, just a single oxygen atom, not an oxygen molecule, which is why it's denoted as 1/2 O2. That just means 1 O, or 1/2 O2. Energy is released as this occurs, and it's a very controlled release of energy for the synthesis of ATP. At each step, energy will be released. So the electrons are released here. They then fall down this energy staircase to the final electron acceptor, which is oxygen. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor because it's highly electronegative, so it's pulling those electrons down that electron transport chain. Once those electrons combine with the oxygen, that oxygen will combine with 2H+ to form H2O. This is why water is a byproduct of cellular respiration, because this oxygen that accepts the 2 electrons that fell down the electron transport chain will then combine with 2 free-floating H+ ions to form H2O. Notice these 2 H+ ions, we have had several instances already. Right here's one where a free hydrogen ion has been released into the cell. So it could come from that. It could come from, I'm going to go back a slide. It could come from NAD+ being reduced to NADH. That also gave off a hydrogen ion. Any of those could supply these hydrogen ions that combine with the 2 electrons and the O to form H2O. Again, I know this might seem a little confusing right now. We are going to talk in detail about each of these processes. I just wanted you to understand how electron carriers work and how, when electrons fall down the energy staircase, energy is released before we start talking about the specific steps of cellular respiration. So the main takeaway from this is that as the electrons fall down the electron transport chain, the energy staircase, they're going to lower and lower energy molecules. So energy is released each time, which is used to synthesize ATP. Our last checkpoint question for this video: what chemical characteristic of the element oxygen accounts for its function in cellular respiration? This wasn't specifically stated on the slides, but I did mention it. It's the fact that oxygen is extremely electronegative, which we've talked about previously. It pulls its electrons close. So this makes it very powerful in pulling electrons down the electron transport chain. They kind of want to fall to eventually be accepted by the oxygen. Okay, we're going to end this video here, and in part 2, we'll talk about the stages of cellular respiration.